So we're gonna get started. I think there's gonna be some people probably flowing in a few minutes late. Really appreciate you coming on today to really speak to our interns. We have 18 college students and 7 high schoolers with us today. So
thank you. Well, welcome to Toledo virtually. I think from what I know about Midstory and the internship program, I think it's a really cool opportunity, especially for Toledo, to have young people telling stories about our community and really changing the perspective of how people view our community. I've been in Toledo for about 2.5 years, and this is my first time as a city administrator. My responsibilities include managing the day-to-day operations of the city. We have about 2,700 employees. We have about 275,000 residents, and we're about 82 square miles. So in terms of population, we are the 4th largest city in Ohio. By size, we're the 2nd largest city in Ohio. I think we were up to about 400,000 residents at our peak point. And so why that's important is because even though we have a reduction in the number of residents, we still are responsible for the same square footage of land. And the decline of population means that we have a decline of income tax revenue, and that income tax revenue is really what drives how we provide city services. So we're responsible for the same amount of land and community, but we have a significantly less amount of resources in order to provide those services. So I'll come back to that after I talk a little bit about my background. Prior to coming here, I spent 18 years in the city of Dayton. I worked for the city for about 12 years. My last 6, I was the executive director of the Human Relations Council, and 6 years prior to that, I was the assistant director. In that role, I was responsible for enforcing all of the city's anti-discrimination ordinances, as well as implementing the city's diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. That included investigating civil rights cases related to employment, public accommodation, credit, and housing. It also meant supporting minority, women-owned, and small disadvantaged businesses and making sure that they had opportunities with the city. So for example, Remy, that looks good. I haven't had lunch yet. But what that meant is that when the city, whenever the city bid projects, we wanted to make sure that a portion of those projects had opportunities for minority, women-owned, and small disadvantaged businesses. We also were responsible for, I can also see the messages too. But we were also responsible for community police relations, gun violence reduction, as well as ensuring that foreign-born citizens had access to resources to appropriately integrate into the community so that we could benefit from the diversity that they bring, the cultural diversity that they bring or brought to the community. And then we also did a lot of work around ensuring that there was there was investment in low to moderate income communities. So a lot of my work was around, one, ensuring that people had the opportunity to enjoy our community and that we were protecting their rights, but then also making sure that we were making equitable investments in the community and advocating for those investments. So most of my background is diversity, equity, and inclusion. When this opportunity came along, the mayor, he was very specific about the demographic that he was, or the characteristics that he was looking for. He really wanted a female chief of staff, and he really wanted an African-American chief of staff. And so as he looked around, he called the mayor in Dayton, and she recommended me. And while this was not my background, I took the position because the things that I was working on in Dayton really impacted the day-to-day lives of Dayton residents. And I wanted to always be in a leadership role where I could help influence policy to make sure that our policies were equitable, and then also influence investment. And I felt like being a city administrator was the greatest opportunity for me to be able to do that. It's been a very challenging role, one, because it's not one that I've been in before, but even more so because Toledo, there are a lot of barriers to moving the community forward. But at the same time, there's a lot of opportunity here. And so where I see my biggest challenge, what my biggest challenge has been, similar to what Dayton's was probably about 15 or 20 years ago, is that Toledo has a self-esteem issue. And so we don't value the resources that are available to us. We don't value the people that we have in certain positions, and we've not nurtured or invested specifically in the city as an organization, but also I see this in some of our nonprofit organizations. We really have not invested in the talent to make sure that we were staying in line with best practices. And so there's a lot of opportunity here where we're seeing more collaborative efforts to move the community forward. And I think that has been even pushed even more so because of the social unrest that's happening as a result of the pandemic and as a result of the relationship between community and police, specifically in communities of color. So when we talk about equitable investment, you really have to think about the history of how communities were created and why we are where we are. So if you've been looking at some of the data that's coming out around the pandemic and stay clued in to some of the concerns that are happening with the pandemic, what we're learning is that Black and Brown communities are disproportionately impacted, both from a health perspective and economically. And the reason being is because of the way communities were created historically. If you are familiar, how many of you are familiar with redlining? For those of you, are you familiar with redlining? Okay, well, for those of you who are not familiar with redlining, if you are not from Toledo, you can Google redlining HOLC maps for your community. And then there is an assessment tool that HUD has where you can look at where there's racial and ethnic concentration as well as concentrated poverty. And what you will find when you compare those two maps is oftentimes you'll see the redlining maps were literally colorful maps, and I'll bring up a map. I'll share my screen and show you a map of the city of Toledo's redlining map. But the redlining map was literally a map that said this is where certain groups could live. So if it was a red map, then if it was a red area or a yellow area, if it was a red area, you couldn't get home insurance, mortgage lending, and it was an area where it was heavily concentrated with African Americans and immigrants. So let me see if I can pull up the map for Toledo really quick. And if it was a yellow area, it was considered a declining area and on the verge of being red. And any of the green and blue areas, those were areas that were really good areas for growth. And then the blue areas were the second tier areas for people to move into. But because of the way that those maps were, because of the way that those communities were divided up, if you fast forward to today and you compare where there's concentrated poverty and hypersegregation, you'll see that the same neighborhoods where people were told they have to live in these communities because of their color or because of their ethnic background are the same neighborhoods that have extreme poverty or that are low opportunity. And so when you talk about extreme poverty and low opportunity, that also impacts your health outcomes because there is a direct correlation oftentimes to crime, post-traumatic stress in those communities, food insecurities in those communities, as well as, oftentimes low wage owners in those communities. You'll see that the school systems in those communities are often some of the schools that are performing at their worst. And so if you think about it, those neighborhoods were created because government policy, literally federal policy that was being enforced at the local level by law enforcement and by elected officials said, no, folks have to live here. Folks cannot have access to mortgage lending. Folks cannot cannot move into the green and blue areas so that they could buy homes, have equity in those homes, take that equity from their homes, use that equity to then pay for their children to go to school so that their children have greater potential for earning wages. And so you really hinder a person's ability to advance economically and both from an academic or educational perspective. So now if you fast forward to today and you look at those communities, these are the same communities that are heavily impacted by the pandemic. And these are the same communities that have comorbidities that lead to higher death rates. In Black and Brown communities, when you look at what is happening with the pandemic, a lot of the individuals that live in those communities are considered essential workers because they're working in those low-wage jobs like the grocery store jobs or the jobs that have direct contact with the public, and they can't call off work because they have limited access to health care, which means that also if they get sick, it's more expensive for them. And so then they end up going to work because they can't afford to take off work. These are the same communities where folks need access to childcare, and childcare has been limited because of the pandemic. So you begin to see how policy impacts a person's ability for growth, for economic growth, and then that limited ability for economic growth also has negative implications for health. The second thing that you're seeing around the community is you're seeing the challenge and relationship between community and police play out, specifically with communities of color. And that relationship is challenged for the same reasons that we talked about why people were not able to earn equity or buy homes and live in certain communities, because traditionally law enforcement was responsible for enforcing the laws that discriminated against people of color and foreign-born citizens that were coming into the community. And so now that relationship was never repaired. If you look at the media that creates a perception of people of color, that plays into the bias of different folks in certain, including law enforcement. When you have law enforcement engaging in communities that were created through these discriminatory policies, they end up developing a bias because of the interactions that they're having with their communities. And you just see this domino effect of the comorbidities related to the pandemic, the social unrest related to community police relations, the education outcomes of children that are living in those communities. And so really it becomes the responsibility of folks like me, of the mayor, of folks like you who may eventually be policymakers or voters to change the trajectory of those communities and create equity in those communities so that folks can thrive. So thinking about all of that, the reason I took this job because I wanted to be able to affect change at a leadership level. I wanted to be at the policy table when folks were thinking about the policies that are going to be implemented in our community. I wanted to be at the table when partners and stakeholders were sitting down talking about how they're going to invest in our communities, so I could lend my voice to helping to make those changes. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions about anything that I've said so far. Am I that good? Not one question.
I have a question, if that's all
If
right.
you could state your name, your major, and then your school, that'd be great before you ask the question.
Sure. So I'm Ethan. Hello. Thank you so much for talking to us. This has been great so far. I'm from Princeton University, and I'm a comparative literature major. Right now, I'm working on a project about education during coronavirus. And I was wondering, like, how is the mayor's office and the kind of local officials working to combat the effects of like the achievement gap that has been even further exacerbated by coronavirus, and like the fact that some people, I mean, even if school does go back in session, maybe they need to work, or you know, parents would love to send their kids away, but like they need childcare or something like that. Yeah.
So the school system is mapping out their plan now. I was actually hoping, we had a call yesterday and hoping to get an update. And so we may not get an update on that until July 28th. I know one of the things that they did at the end of the school year last year is they added Wi-Fi to some of the buses and put some of the buses in the community so that families could access the Wi-Fi. I think that there's going to be a lot of challenge and concern if you're staying abreast of what's going on, which I'm sure you are if you're working in this space. You know, you have a lot of parents that are like, you have some parents that are like, I'm not sending my child back to school. But then you have other parents who are like, I have to take a risk of, you know, my child potentially getting infected so that I can go back to work, or them starving because I don't have access to resources. And so that's going to be a very difficult discussion. And then the other challenge is kind of talking about these same communities that I just shared with you and the barriers that exist. You know, I think there was one community that said about 50% of the children from some of these neighborhoods are not logging in. They don't have folks that are on them saying, hey, you need to do your homework, or that can even really help them with their homework, making sure that they have access to laptops and computers to be able to get on. So I think those are all of the things that are being considered. And what I will do is I will make sure that Sam and Ruth, that you all have the Zoom link for our, we have a bi-weekly meeting with the community and the mayor. And the next one is July 28th at 1 o'clock. And I'm hoping that we have somebody from the school system on talking about their plans for returning back to school in the fall.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Jose Pablo. I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. I go to Princeton, likely studying public policy.
Mm-hmm.
And earlier you mentioned that Toledo has a lot of barriers to change or to moving forward. So what do you think are some of those barriers?
So I think, I would say internal to the city, you know, the way that I look at the administration's role is that we're responsible for day-to-day operations. And of course, if you know anything about local government, the elected officials are responsible for policy, and then we are responsible for operationalizing those policies. Well, sometimes you will find that elected officials put policy forth with push policy without having a conversation about operational and budgetary impact. And that becomes a challenge because we are responsible for implementing any policies that the elected officials put forth. So one of the barriers is when, and this is not just specific to Toledo, this is specific to other communities as well, but one of the barriers is that you have elected officials that are elected by citizens, and they are trying to be responsive to their constituency. That constituency may not always understand the nuances of operationalizing a policy. And so when you aren't having those discussions, and if you don't have trust between the administration and the elected officials, and if the elected officials don't have a real understanding of the nuances of advancing policy, it becomes a real challenge for us to get work done. So one big challenge is communication between elected officials and administrators. The other challenge is that, you know, whenever you are trying to do good for a community, you have all of these competing interests. So I'll give you an example of, you know, what's happening around community police relations. You have a community that's really frustrated with the hit with police brutality, with how police are showing up, and the community with negative interactions that they've experienced in the community. And so for us, we've had all of that social unrest around all of the things that that other cities are experiencing. Well, what happened, so we're starting to have conversations about policy reform. Well, 2 weeks ago, we had an officer killed. So one of the policy recommendations that's coming out, if you're familiar with the 8 Can't Wait and Campaign Zero and some of the other policy recommendations, is that, you know, a police officer needs to announce themselves before they shoot. So if you think about, and I'm not a law enforcement officer, I've done some scenario-based training and things like that, and I'm not advocating one way or the other, but I am, communicating to you some of the conflicting priorities that come up. So you have a situation where community wants officers to announce themselves before they shoot. We had a situation where an officer was doing a well check because there was an individual that was intoxicated, and they were called in by some other folks that were hanging out, that this individual was bothering them. And so the officer came, he called the guy and said, hey, stop, want to talk to you. The guy kept walking, and then he turned around and shot and killed the officer. So that officer didn't have time to say, hey, stop, I'm going to shoot. You have to think quickly about how to respond. And so now you have a community of officers that are hurting because their colleague was killed, and then you have a community that's hurting because they've seen someone that looks like them, or looks like their brother, or looks like their father, or looks like their son that was killed at the hand of police officers. So it's always, how do you have those discussions and come to a place where both parties can agree on reform that keeps the officer safe, but also keeps the community safe as well. And, a really important part of that is this legitimacy of authority. And so if you have studied community police relations and how officers interact in the community, legitimacy of authority is really important. And what that means is, if you have an interaction with someone and you say, for instance, a traffic stop, if that person feels like you've handled them with respect, even if you give them a ticket, or even if the outcome is not one that they want, because they felt like they were treated with respect, and because it was a positive interaction that ended in an outcome that they didn't want, there was legitimacy in that authority. And so that has to come with whenever there's an interaction with police officers and law enforcement. The other concern that I have, being someone that's worked in this space around building relationships between community and police, is that you have all of these negative images that are put out around Black and brown communities that really play into folks' psyche. And so if you don't have those personal interactions with folks from that don't look like you, that don't have your same background or your same experience, then you will read those headlines, or you will see that what's in the media and the stories that the narrative that people put out, that are put out about certain communities, and then that becomes your belief system about your interactions with that community. That is your bias, your implicit bias about dealing with that community. And so as we're thinking about reform, and as we think about, putting forth policies to make policing safer for our communities, the other conversation needs to be, how do we change those negative images that are put out in the community about certain groups, that plays into a person's psyche when they have interactions with different populations. So there's a Harvard bias study. I don't know if you have ever seen this implicit bias study that you can take, and it helps you to understand what your biases are. Everybody has bias. There is nobody in this world that does not have bias. Your bias is based on how you were raised. It's based on the friends that you're around. It's based on your life experiences. It is how you respond to that bias and the techniques that you put in place to make sure that bias doesn't impact how you interact with people and how you make life-changing decisions when you have those interactions. And so that's the other part of the conversation is how do we change policy that impacts how law enforcement engages with the community, but it is also about how do we change the narrative that is put out there by media or certain groups about other groups that is a false narrative, and how do we promote better interactions between those groups so that there's a better outcome when they engage with one another. Any other questions or concerns or things that you want to express about what's been happening?
Hi, I'm Ciel. I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I'm studying creative writing and literature at the University of Michigan right now. So earlier you were talking about how Toledo at its peak had about 400,000 citizens, but now now it's in a state of decline, you're still responsible for the same area. So what have been some things that you in the city have done to kind of cope with that loss of income tax while still maintaining the same area?
Well, you know, we've had to adjust, you know, how we provide services. So I'll give you grass for an example. You all probably don't think that grass would be a major city issue, but it's the bane of my existence from April to September of every year, because, well, probably more like July of every year, because in the spring we get a lot of rain. And so that means that the grass grows quite a bit. And then in July, as it gets warmer, the grass doesn't grow as much. Well, you know, a couple things. Well, the first thing is that, you know, in some of the communities that we talked about earlier, where I talked about the redlining and some of the decline in those communities have a lot more vacant property and absentee landlords, which means that those properties are not being taken care of. We have high grass, and it becomes the city's responsibility to maintain those properties. So what we've had to figure out, normally, if we had the resources in place, we would try to cut that grass every 2 weeks so that it could look pristine and so the community could look beautiful. But because we have limited resources, sometimes we may not be able to cut some of those properties for 4 weeks to save costs. The other challenge that we're finding is that, you know, because of those limited resources, we have limited access to equipment that would make it easier to cut some of those properties. And so that's something else that we're looking into, is that how do we make sure that we address the equipment capital needs so that we could do a better job of taking care of those properties. So it's really, you know, what we're doing is we're looking at how do we adjust our costs, what are some cost savings measures, and which is not always satisfactory to the community, because they want the grass cut every 2 weeks, and you want the nice lineup, and you want the hedges to look like elephants and lions and bears. Oh my, you know, all of those things that that make a community attractive, but that costs money and a higher level of skill. So we're always trying to manage where, you know, what are the priorities based on what the community is telling us, based on what our data is telling us, and how do we align our resources to those priorities. So unfortunately, part of the cost savings measure is cutting back on how often we provide a service, or we may have to provide like very basic services that are not necessarily, you know, what the community is looking for. The other part of it is, you know, our economic development department plays a huge role in how we attract and retain talent, because they're also looking at how we attract and retain industry. And so, you know, one of those things is, you know, we know that we have eds and meds here. So education, and you know, we have a good medical system here, and that attracts talent. But we also know we're having a hard time, you know, getting nurses that have certain expertise and things like that. So we have to look at what type of incentives we can provide to help attract talent to our community. And then also, you know, with the properties, the vacant properties and things that we have, we just brought on a new community development person who has an extensive background in building neighborhoods. And so we're looking at what type of housing programs we can provide to encourage people to invest in our communities. How can we work with our land bank to help sell those properties, or help individuals acquire those properties so that they can fix them up and either live in them, or they might be properties that we can resell. So we're also looking at, you know, how do we realign our resources in a way that we can leverage it with other resources from other organizations to benefit individuals that want to move in our community. Hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. I'm trying to monitor the chat to make sure there's no questions coming up in the chat, as well as respond to you all as well. Any other questions?
I have a question that sort of straddles a couple of the focuses that you've mentioned. I'm Remy. I'm the serial guy. I'm at Princeton studying public policy, and also currently kind of working on some like a talk and a piece about homelessness in the Midwest. I'm really familiar with the issue in California, and So I don't exactly know like the sort of scene in Toledo and in Ohio, but beyond kind of what I've read. But I was wondering kind of, since you have done work with like police community relations, and then also sort of on the housing side, which obviously feeds into the problem of homelessness a lot. I was wondering kind of how you and the city in general have kind of been thinking about and approaching this issue of like police community relations when it comes to homelessness. Because, in San Diego, we have, across California and in a lot of cities, there's this issue of like police raids and kind of criminalization of homelessness, right? Which can make it really hard for people to sort of gain stability, keep their property, et cetera. And so I'm wondering if, like, to what extent you have sort of, approach that from a policy lens, and how the city is kind of conceptualizing of police community relations with respect to homelessness in terms of, giving people mobility and access.
So a couple things around homelessness. One thing that that we need to strengthen locally is our continuum of care for homeless, and actually right before this meeting, I had another meeting to talk about one of our shelters that provide services to the homeless population, and our community development director they were talking about how we need to improve our continuum of care. And then also the relationship, so that we're not duplicating efforts, and so the resources stretch further. And so that's one thing that we need to do, is to really look at our continuum of care. I have not gotten a whole lot, fortunately, I've not gotten a whole lot of feedback about negative relationships between the community or the homeless community and the police. I will say that Toledo, in terms of criminal justice reform, is trying to be progressive from that perspective. There's a lot of areas where we're not very progressive, but I've been on some ends when it comes to like housing court and making sure that people have eviction protections and things like that. We're really trying to do a lot of work to help ensure that people are not homeless. And then secondly, trying to figure out, make sure that we have systems built to avoid homelessness. And then the other thing is just really making sure that the police department is connected to our social service network, and so that they have access to those individuals, so that when they do have those interactions, they can direct them to services. So one of the things that I will say is that as we get feedback, like for example, if we get a lot of feedback about negative interactions or criminalization of the homeless populations, one of the things that we've been really good at with this administration is, having a conversation about how can we be more friendly to certain populations if we see that there's an uptick in concern. But that is, so I will also check and make sure that that I'm not missing something, but I've just not gotten a whole lot of complaints about, negative interactions with the homeless population. The one thing that I will say that has come out of some of the discussions around community police relations, and then just really and just really dealing with some of the mental health issues that officers are having to deal with, because our mental health systems have been declining across the country because of lack of resources to support mental health, is that, some police departments are looking at how do we provide social works in police departments. So they may not necessarily go out on the call, but making sure that officers have a direct contact within the police department of somebody that is able to connect folks to resources if we have somebody that we've had to engage because of a mental health crisis or something like that. We're not perfect, but we are continuing to try to be open to being progressive around those issues. I just saw something.
Thank you.
The forefront political discussion about your
Hi, I'm Cordelia. I put a question in the chat. I'm a rising junior at Toledo Technology Academy, and I actually had a chance to hear you speak earlier through Youth Leadership Toledo. So my question was, in recent weeks, police brutality and racial equality have been at the forefront of political discussions, but you have been advocating for these issues for years. How do recent events leverage, if that's a good word, your policy goals?
So So a couple, I think what you're asking is maybe how have I been able to use my experience in this discussion, or are you asking me, what are we doing around policy reform with these issues related to these?
Yeah, I was wondering if you had plans before and if the protests have allowed your colleagues to realize the importance of the policy goals you had.
So, from my perspective, community police relations is twofold. So there's definitely this history of between the relationship of Black and Brown communities and law enforcement. But I strongly believe that relationship is also impacted by the lack of investment in certain communities. So my perspective on addressing these issues is not only addressing it from the implicit bias and policy reform, but it's also about how are we investing in these neighborhoods that have higher interactions with law enforcement or who have negative feelings about law enforcement. So, we took a survey in Dayton. We just had a poll done here about how people feel about police. And consistently, you are going to find that African-American communities and poorer communities and younger generations are going to have negative feelings about police. So the first thing is, one thing with younger generations, oftentimes what we also find, at least in the Dayton study, is that it wasn't based on their direct interaction with police officers, but their perception or somebody that they knew had a negative interaction with police officers. They didn't necessarily have full context of what led to the situation, but that created a negative perception. And I'm just trying to give you some backstory before I answer your question. So there's definitely a generational issue around the relationship between community and police, where we find that older individuals tend to want more policing, younger individuals want less policing. So that's that conflict that we have when we're trying to figure out policy recommendations. The other thing that we found is, there's definitely a race issue. So when we looked at the data said that, African Americans have had a negative viewpoint, where Caucasians had a more positive feeling about police. And then there's definitely the income correlation. So direct correlation. So, for me, it is about how do I leverage the limited resources that the city has. So one of the projects that I'm working on is how do we create these public-private relationships and get all of our resources aligned around specific priorities to impact our communities that are most severely impacted because of some of these disparities. And then to me, that will eventually help with some of the relationship between community and police. On the policy side, now, so this goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where you have policymakers who want to respond to their constituents. So they put legislation forth, and then we got to figure out how to operationalize it. So on the policy side, we have 12 council members. We have 4 council members submit, I think, somewhere between 4 to 6 pieces of legislation. And they didn't talk to each other about the legislation. They didn't talk to the administration about the legislation. They didn't talk to the law department about the legislation. And so what that meant is that, one, some of the legislation really should have been administrative policy that's in the police handbook. But then the other thing is really thinking through, what is this going to mean for staffing? What is this going to mean? What is the budgetary impact on this? What is the operational impact on this? You're hearing a lot about defunding police. If you implement these policies and people are saying, we want you to divest in police and invest in communities, if there's a budget impact because of this policy, we can't divest, because we're going to have to spend more to implement these policies. So it's all of those conversations that you have to have as you're thinking about how do you advance policies that are, one, equitable when you talk about policing, and that makes communities safer. And then third, that makes sure that our officers go home at night to their families. So what we were able to do, and this is going to be a challenge, but what we were able to do is ask council members to put the legislation in committee, and then we formed a community task force of about 30 to 35 people with officers and community members who are going to sit down and have a conversation about all of these policy recommendations. Now, I've done this before in Dayton. The biggest challenge that we ran into in Dayton with doing this work is that it takes a long time to build trust. It takes a very long time to build trust, and without that trust, it's very difficult to have very real conversations where people are vulnerable about their experiences with law enforcement and where law enforcement doesn't feel like they're attacked and they're willing to engage. And so that's going to be the biggest barrier to having these discussions about policy reform that both the community and law enforcement agree on. So we have this this task force. They were supposed to meet, actually they were supposed to meet for the first time last week, and it just so happened that that was the same day of the memorial for the officer that was killed. So we're going to meet later on this month to start those discussions. And for 6 months, we'll start working on policy recommendations and see where we get, and then we'll make plans from there. But it's a very, very difficult process. If I think about what happened in Dayton, we started this work probably in 2012, 2013, and a lot of the policy recommendations that are coming out now after the George Floyd incident, those are the same things that we were talking about in 2012 and 2013. And, you know, there's a lot of frustration around, you know, okay, why aren't we in a better place? And they're starting that process all over again. I'm reading a book called The Sword and the Shield, and it's about MLK and Malcolm X. It does a analysis of the approach that both MLK and Malcolm X had around civil rights. Same conversation, police brutality, economic equity, civil rights, the exact same conversations that we're having today. And so, you know, if we keep having these same conversations year after year after year, there is something fundamentally wrong with our systems and how our country is addressing equity. Which leads to your question around policy with policing, because all of that is intertwined, if that makes sense. I feel like I'm talking in circles. Any other questions?
Hi, I'm David. I'm a high school intern in Cleveland, actually. I was wondering. Oh, nice. I was wondering when you were talking about how you send out these polls and these studies and these like referendums. Is that, does the Toledo government do those polling themselves, or do you hire like a third party to do that? And if you do, like how much of a budget do you allocate for that to get it like done successfully?
In Toledo, the mayor, he did a poll with his funding from his campaign. So he did a poll, and that's where we were able to get the information. In Dayton, there's an outside consultant that actually does the community poll, and theirs is a little bit more robust, and that is looking at all city services. And I think I'll have to find out about how much money is allocated. I think it's about $150,000. It's not a well, maybe not that much, but it's not an inexpensive process. It's not an inexpensive process, but it's a very important one.
Do you find like town halls and forums to be better to get public opinions, or just surveys?
No, I think it's a combination. I think that, you know, partly because, you know, surveys, you tend to have a much broader group of people responding, and you can take that sampling, and that sampling gives you a good indication of what the community feedback. But focus groups add context, and town halls add context, and it also allows the community to have voice and to feel like they're being heard. It's brutal when you're on the administrative side of it or when you're on the elected official side of it, but it's an important process that you have to go through. Which also, you know, one of the things that I tell people all the time, you know, especially you're seeing this with the social unrest that we're having, is that, you know, agitators, disruptors, folks that are out here protesting are very, very important to the policymaking process, because some, you know, policymaking is have you ever heard the term sausage making? it is very much like sausage making. So if you think about the sausage making process, you got to get it from the cow to the end of the process. And for those of you, I don't eat, only eat fish. So that's probably not the best example, but it's something that I hear oftentimes is that, it's a sausage making process. It's long. It is a lot of negotiation. It's a lot of consideration for how do you operationalize those policies and things like that. But you have, in order to get there, you have to have folks that are bringing voice to the issue. Because in my seat, at one point I was at the grassroots level and I was working in the community and I was there listening and engaging. But when you're in the administrator seat, there are things that you miss. And so it's really important that, for those of you who are going to be in leadership positions, it's very important for you to understand your role at the policymaking table and making sure that you have people around you that are at the grassroots level sharing with you what is happening on the ground so that you make sure that you're making the right decisions for the community that you serve. So that's where the town hall and focus groups are important because they bring context. Polls, they're only numbers, and you want to make sure that what you're hearing matches up to what the data is telling you.
Do most local governments just contract third parties to do the data collection?
So, you can collect data in a lot of different ways. So, for something like that, most likely, because you usually don't have a researcher or somebody that's doing that kind of work. I used to work for, before working for the city of Dayton, I used to work for the Center for Urban and Public Affairs at Wright State. And that was actually the department that did the polling for the city of Dayton on city services and things like that. So oftentimes you'll see cities and communities contract with the local university or with a pollster or something like that to get that information. But the other way that we collect data is through for example, we have what is called CityWorks. A lot of communities have Engage Toledo is what we have also, or 311 systems where people can call in and seek services. When you call in and you ask for services, that goes into a system, and then we can dissect that information so that it helps us improve services. So what you're finding across communities is that there's a huge push on data-driven decision-making and how do you use data to improve services. So we get data from a lot of different places. Any other questions?
I had a question about immigrant integration. Mm-hmm. I'm Carolyn. I'm a senior studying public policy at Princeton. And so I was interested in learning more about immigrant integration in Toledo, any major challenges in that area right now, and whether you think those immigrant arrivals are going to be able to kind of offset the depopulation trends you were discussing earlier.
So and I'm not as engaged around the work that we're doing with Welcome TLC, which is our welcoming initiative in Toledo. I will tell you so I don't have the specific data around our growth. I think that if we have that transition where foreign-born citizens or immigrants begin to replace our population, it's gonna take some time because we've had such a significant population decline. Most of our immigrant community we have a lot of folks. We have a large Lebanese population. I think we have a large population, Hungarian population. We have a huge Polish population here, but they're families that have been here, for generations. If I think about, if I go back to the work that I was doing in Dayton, because I was much more involved with that work because it was out of my office, that was one of the things. And actually, if you think about, I don't know if you're familiar with Welcoming America, which is they have a certification for communities who want to become more welcoming, and they have all of these standards that communities use to help make sure that they're more welcoming. But one of the things that Welcome in America have been looking at is how communities are transitioning with foreign-born citizens and how they're adding to or how they're replacing population. And so what we saw in Dayton is that the Hispanic population was the fastest growing population in our community. And so we we had a growing refugee community. And so we were trying to figure out, okay, number one, there's two parts to that. So the first part is that it's an economic driver. We know that immigrants start businesses at a higher rate. They tend to be more entrepreneurial. And so they add value to your community because that creates jobs. We also know that they're willing to take risk at a higher level. And so they may start a business that isn't successful, but they'll start another business and another business until they find one where they are successful. So from an economic development perspective, it's a huge opportunity not only to attract for job creation and retention, but it's also a huge opportunity because you'll find that communities that embrace and value diversity actually thrive. They do better economically. Those are the communities that, where we're experiencing a brain drain. Those are the communities that are attracting young talent. And so for us, while we have a slower growth in our immigrant population, it's a huge opportunity for us to look at how we can be more attractive. But then there's the other side of it where, that cities have to think about is that not only is it an economic driver, but you also have to make sure that you have social systems in place for immigrants and foreign-born citizens to be able to integrate because they're coming to a totally different culture. There's a huge learning curve. If you're first generation, there's potentially a language barrier. How do you make sure that employers are ready to accept immigrants into their employment, and how are you and making sure that you're respecting the cultural differences that they bring to the table and their cultural norms and your everyday operations. And so there's also this social service side, for lack of better words, that has to be considered to make sure that we're appropriately integrating immigrants into our community, but then secondly, that we're making sure that they have all of the resources to be successful. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, if I'm going to try to remember, Sam, I hope you were taking notes. So, I'm going to send a couple things, about the redlining maps. I'll try to send a few books. One book that's really good to read is called Color of Law. I think that's a really good book that talks about how communities are created and really speaks to, why we are in the situation that we're in when we're talking about equity and disparity in our communities and the health implications of discrimination. So that's a really good book for you to read. I'll also send you some information on Welcoming America if you're interested in immigrant integration and some of the certification requirements for cities who are interested in becoming a welcoming community. I'll send you that information. I'll send you a link to, there's an organization called NACOLE, which is the National Association of Civilian Oversight for Law Enforcement. So anyone is interested in police reform or what's happening around like citizen police relations, review boards, I'll send you that information. That'll be a good resource, as well as the Dayton site on community police relations, so that you can see some of the work that I was able to do while I was in Dayton. I'm trying to think of some of the other, the survey. Someone asked about, the young man that asked about the survey. I don't see you right now, but I'll send you the link to the survey, that the citizens survey that Dayton does every year, so that you can get a sense of the questions that they ask and how communities use that data to impact services. Am I missing anything else that I talked about? And then I'll send you the Zoom link for the call for the education. I'll send that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, appreciate your time. I know out of your busy schedule, for you to speak to the students is really, it's a great, fantastic opportunity for them. They're working on a variety of different kinds of projects. So as I find projects that you might be a good resource for, I'll definitely, let them, I'll give you some questions and stuff like that if you have some resources to provide them. But really appreciate your time. I think the questions were tough and the answers were really well executed. Katy, I think you really gave some really good responses to some of these students' questions. There's more. I can promise you there's more, because I've been talking to some of these students just individually, and there's definitely a lot of questions. And I think they're searching for their own kind of story here in the Midwest. So I think it's really encouraging to see what they're doing with these narratives and these stories. So truly appreciate the opportunity to speak with the students. I'll definitely send any additional questions your way and appreciate the resources. I'll look for your email. If there's any additional resources that, like you said, you wanted to send over to me, I can give them to the students as well. So if we could all just give Katy just like a virtual round of applause, just really appreciate her time and energy. Really, I think, we're really lucky to have her as chief of staff for Toledo here. And, I think there's a lot of change that needs to be done, but I think she's at the forefront of a lot of the change that is being done here in Toledo. So truly appreciative. Also, the mayor also had an opportunity to speak with the students as well. So it's just really fantastic to hear such a progressive, forward-thinking.
He tell you stories. He always shares stories.
He had plenty of stories. He does love his stories.
All right. Well, I put my email address in the chat, and I'm always open for a virtual coffee or anything like that. And I'm looking forward to the stories that you all have to share. The one thing that I do want to leave you all with is that, you all are really smart, and you all are important contributors to our future. The generation before me messed it up. I'm not going to say my generation, because we're ignored. I'm a generation X, and nobody sees us. But we've really messed it up. We've really messed it up, and so we need folks who are going to come in and advance policy to get us back on the right track. We're at a very, very interesting time in the world, but definitely in our country, and so we need really good voices. Oh, wait a minute. This is Gen Z? Okay. Did I say you all were millennials? Wait a minute. I'm Gen X, right? So Gen X didn't mess it up. The boomers did. All right. Well, have a good afternoon. And again, don't hesitate, to reach out. I'm always up for the hard questions, and I welcome a challenge. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Katy. I'll definitely keep in touch and talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you. Talk to you all soon. Bye-bye.